Hey class, today we'll be covering the global interactions of 1450 to 1750.
Let's talk about that.
I'm just playing, we're not doing that. That's for basic people.
First, let's talk about some huge European developments. During this time period, major changes in the European continent involved
1. The way people viewed themselves. 2. The way governments viewed their authority. 3. The way religion affected politics in singularity. And 4. The way Europeans thought and interacted with the rest of the world.
There were four cultural movements that resulted from local issues such as the concern for salvation, territorial disputes, the Black Death, lack of education outside monasteries, and small-scale trade. Next up was the Protestant Reformation. The Roman Catholic Church, up until this point, was the unifying force between everyone in Europe. Many people believed that to get into heaven, they would have to follow the Church. Taking advantage of their beliefs, the Church began to sell indulgences, which were false documents that were supposed to get you into heaven faster. Realizing this corruption, Martin Luther posted a list of 95 theses showing his displeasure toward the Church, including things such as the sale of indulgences and the languages of the Church services only in Latin. He eventually branched off and began his own religion, where his followers were known as Lutherans. John Calvin, another important Protestant, changed the way many thought through his belief that God had already predetermined everyone's fate, so people like Charles would maintain an F average for the rest of their lives. King Henry VIII formed the Church of England, or Anglican Church, after being denied a divorce by the Church. In an attempt to regain their lost influence, the Church began the Catholic Reformation, or Counter-Reformation, where faith was more clearly defined, heretics were punished, and the Catholic Church became more successful again.
The first was the Renaissance. This Reformation saw the rise of humanism, which is the focus on human achievements and endeavors. Simply put, people were worrying about themselves rather than how they were going to chill with their dead homeboys in heaven. Art and literature became significantly more popular, especially in Florence, Venice, and Milan. Some pretty famous people during this time included Shakespeare and almost all of the Ninja Turtles, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Donatello. Their artwork was influenced by Christian beliefs, and the introduction of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in 1453 allowed for the mass production of books, and the prices were lowered. The result? The middle class was able to write in their own vernacular, or native tongue, and became more educated. The scientific revolution was another cultural movement in this period. The purpose was to prove life and Earth's natural processes through science. The studies by guys such as Galileo, Copernicus, and Sir Isaac Newton threatened the Church's influence, and were therefore punished. The Church basically said, if you ain't with us, we're gonna put you behind
these nuts. Got him!
No, behind these bars, as in these prison bars. My gosh, that's almost as immature as Zach.
I agree.
Back to the scientific revolution. Two religious beliefs that were branched from this revolution were atheism, the belief that there is no God, and deism, the belief that there is a God, but is passive in life.
The final cultural movement of this time was the Enlightenment, which focused on the relationship between government and mankind. The divine right of monarchs is a belief that monarchs have power given to them by God to govern. This was very similar to the concept of the mandate of heaven. The idea of the social contract began to emerge in the 17th century, which instituted the idea that the need of the people fueled the government's power, not religion. Supporters of the concept included Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Thomas Hobbes thought people were greedy and prone to violent warfare.
Shout out to the Mongols.
And that the government should preserve peace and stability under the social contract. Locke thought people were naturally good and had unalienable rights, and if the government violated these rights, they could revolt. Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought everyone was equal and society should be governed by majority rule. An interesting fact was that he actually wrote a book named The Social Contract, which outlined his beliefs.
Let's branch off a little bit and talk about European exploration and expansion. The purpose of these explorations were to eliminate Muslim middlemen and discover trade routes to Asia. Some European explorers included Vasco da Gama, who rounded the Cape of Good Hope to establish Indian trade routes, Christopher Columbus, the man who accidentally discovered the Americas by sailing the ocean blue in 1492 instead of Asia, and gave us an excuse to skip school to go shopping. And Amerigo Vespucci, who discovered South America and has an entire 2 continents named after him. Some new technologies that increase the efficiency of maritime navigation include the stern-post rudder, lateen sails, astrolabe, magnetic compass, and 3-masted caravels. The arrival of Europeans into the New World resulted in the transfer of diseases such as the bubonic plague, which wiped out a massive percentage of American natives, but they were not immune to these diseases. And this allowed for Europeans to conquer the natives much more easily. When Spain established itself in the New World, they set up the encomienda system, a new social hierarchy that consisted of peninsulares, Spanish officials who were at the top, Creoles, people born in the colonies to Spanish parents, then mestizos, those of European and Native American ancestry, then mulattoes, European and African ancestry, and finally there were Native Americans and Africans who had very little freedom. Prior to the Atlantic trade, slavery already existed in Africa. Europeans just perpetuated the trade by expanding it across the ocean to the New World via the Middle Passage. They did this because the plantations needed workers, and slaves were the cheapest option. The Columbian Exchange was the transfer of animals, plants, diseases, people, technology, and ideas across the Atlantic among Europe, the Americas, and Africa. Europe and Africa brought horses, pigs, goats, and sugarcane to the Americas. The Americas showed Europe squash, beans, corn, and potatoes. Other things such as Catholicism, silver, and guns were also transferred. The concept of a joint stock company, an organization that pooled resources from merchants and investors who distributed the cost and risk of colonization, made investing safer. Mercantilism, the practice by trade nations to keep a balance between exports and imports, became prominent as well.
Alright, that's enough about that. Now let's talk about the rest of the world. Spain and Portugal in this time were both very focused on expansion. To cease conflict in the Americas, the two signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, which established a line of demarcation, kind of like the line children invent to split things among themselves. Everything to the east was for Portugal, everything to the west of the line belonged to Spain. Under King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella, Charles V, and Philip II, Spain developed into a major world empire spanning from Europe to the Americas. While Spain focused on colonizing the Americas, Portugal dominated the Spice Islands, the Indian Ocean, and coastal Africa. Eventually, both were overtaken in dominance by European rivals such as the Dutch, the British, and the French, but were still present in the colonies.
England at this time was ruled by Elizabeth I, who oversaw a golden age known as the Elizabethan Age. The Muscovy Company and the British East India Company were founded, and religious battles between Anglicans, Catholics, and other Protestant groups were still prominent. As you see, the English were quite unique in their names. James I tried to reduce problems by accommodating Catholics and Puritans, but the Puritans did not want to recognize the power of the king over religious matters, which caused them to cross the Atlantic. The colonies of Plymouth, founded by the Pilgrims, and Jamestown were formed during the reign of James I. Oliver Cromwell defeated Charles I, who refused to acknowledge the power of Parliament, and led the English Commonwealth, but he ruled with religious intolerance. James II restored power to the throne in the Stuart Restoration and protected people from unlawful arrest with the Habeas Corpus Act. James II, who succeeded him, was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution, and the English Bill of Rights was signed.
In France, as in many places, there was religious conflict. Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes, which created an environment for both Catholics and Huguenots, French Protestants. Later, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, which caused many Huguenots to leave France, and he appointed Jean-Baptiste Colbert as royal treasurer. Germany also had religious divisions, the north being Lutheran while the south was Catholic. At this time, Germany was known as the Holy Roman Empire, but it wasn't in Rome. It was in parts of Germany and present-day Austria. It was very feudal, so the emperor had little power, and essentially it was just a collection of city-states. The Holy Roman Empire lost parts of Hungary to the Ottoman Turks, and the 30 Years' War devastated the Germany region. And Protestants challenged the authority of the emperor, which further weakened its role. The Peace of Westphalia resulted, and it gave German city-states independence, Prussia being the strongest of the newly independent city-states.
Russia, specifically Moscow, was the center of Orthodox Christianity following the fall of the Byzantine Empire, which was called the Third Rome. Ivan III declared Russia free of Mongol rule, and later Ivan IV established absolute rule in Russia, which unified it and allowed Cossacks or peasants to own land as long as they could conquer it themselves. Ivan IV became known as Ivan the Terrible because he was formidable, became Tsar, and ruled under a reign of terror. The time of troubles occurred when there was no Tsar and there were many pretenders to the throne, but Michael Romanov established stability when he was elected Tsar. Peter the Great westernized Russia, built a navy, and adopted many Western fashions. Catherine the Great continued the westernization but with more enlightened policies such as reading. There were 3 Islamic gunpowder empires of prominence during this era: Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal.
The Ottoman Empire was founded by Osman Bey, who conquered the Byzantine Empire by invading Constantinople in 1453 and conquering it. Constantinople became the capital of the Ottoman Empire under the name Istanbul, and the Hagia Sophia was made into a mosque. The Ottomans enslaved the children of their Christian subjects and turned them into Janissaries, who were their warriors. Suleiman I, also known as Suleiman the Magnificent, built up the army of the Ottomans, encouraged the arts, oversaw the golden age of the Ottomans from 1520 to 1566, conquered parts of the Holy Roman Empire, and expanded the reach of Islam greatly. The Safavid Empire was the main rival of the Ottomans. They were based upon conquest and were predominantly Shiite.
The Mughal Empire was started by Babur, who was Muslim, when he conquered the Delhi Sultanate in India. Akbar, the grandson of Babur, unified most of India because of his religious tolerance. He allowed for both Hinduism and Islam to be practiced, and even revoked the jizya, the tax on Hindus. He also tried to eliminate sati, the practice of widows burning themselves on their husbands' funeral pyres. He created the golden age of the Mughal Empire with art, architecture, and thought. Shah Jahan, Akbar's grandson, built the famous Taj Mahal. Arranged and reversed Akbar's actions of religious tolerance, and Hindus began to be persecuted, which caused Hindus to begin to rebel against the Muslims. At the beginning of the 17th century, Christian missionaries introduced Christianity to India, and the British East India Company dominated Indian trade. Africa contributed vastly to the trans-Saharan trade, with key exports of slaves, salt, and gold. The kingdoms of Songhai, Congo, and Angola were dominated by Portuguese and their desire for the slaves.
China, at the beginning of this period, was dominated by the Ming dynasty, who had a centralized government based upon Confucian principles. They attempted to revive the economy with silver currency, but eventually declined due to the Portuguese. The Qing, or Manchu dynasty, followed the Ming. The Manchus were an ethnic elite, so the Chinese were forbidden from learning their language or marrying Manchus. Kangxi and Qianlong, who were Manchu emperors, were Confucian scholars who expanded the empire to Mongolia, Central Asia, Tibet, Vietnam, Burma, and Nepal. The Qing traded with Europeans, but were very protective of their culture. Their main exports were tea, silk, and porcelain.
Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, which was established by Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1600, which created a strict and rigid government. He created 4 classes: the warrior, the farmer, the artisan, and the merchant. The catch? Once you're in a class, you couldn't move between them. The Tokugawa period, also known as the Edo period because the capital was moved to Edo, which is modern-day Japan, caused reverse Western influence. The national seclusion policy was set in place, and this prohibited Japanese from traveling outside the country and restricted most foreigners from entering Japan. Basically, the entire country was full of loners like Darren who spends most of their free time making hard freaking quizzes. Anyways, the kabuki theater and haiku poetry also became very popular during this time.
In this time period, several women held high positions of power in empires, such as Elizabeth I of England and Isabella of Spain. However, as a whole, the amount of jobs held by women decreased, and jobs that used to be held by women, such as textile weaving, became dominated by men. African men were forced to migrate to the Americas, which caused there to be more women than men in Africa, which caused polygamy, marriage to more than one person, to become more commonly practiced. In Europe, although many men also migrated from there, multiple marriages weren't allowed under their religions, so many women remained unmarried. The role of women in society remained far behind that of men.